our second speaker is Cleve Arguelles from the University of Philippines. Cleve is assistant professor and chair of the political science program over there. And he is very influential on Instagram. Is that right? On Twitter, more than 5,000 followers.
Thank you, Professor Audrey. Good afternoon to everyone. My presentation today, which is about the emerging politics of digital citizenship in the Philippines among young Filipino millennials, is part of a broader project to understand how millennials make sense of their world. No? We have two forthcoming edited volumes, and I draw from my contribution to those volumes in understanding how Filipino millennials are innovating their political practices. Around the globe, young people are accused of being apathetic. So some scholars, for example, are observing that they have been abandoning traditional exercises or practices of citizenship. For example, voting in elections, joining political parties, supporting politicians. What these apathetic millennials are being accused of is that they have been too focused on trivial matters. For example, Rolando Tolentino accused Filipino millennials as being too focused on matters involving sex, wealth, and social media, rejecting the traditional expectations that young people need to be politically involved to renew societies, to reform and renew societies. Some even go further and allege that the crisis of democracy right now that we are experiencing around the world is due to a very politically complacent generation. Without young people supporting mainstream democratic institutions, it will cause atrophy and therefore cause this crisis. These conversations, these global conversations on the supposed apathy of millennials is also reflected in the Philippines. No? In the previous national elections in 2016, for example, young Filipinos were blamed to be responsible for the near victory of the unrepentant son of the former dictator Ferdinand Marcos for the post of the vice presidency. They were told that because they were ahistorical and lack concern for the politics of the nation, they have voted the unrepentant son of the former dictator. And yet, in this study, what I argue is that part of the reasons why millennials are being accused of being politically apathetic is because the forms of their political engagement or civic engagement are changing and emerging. And these forms of civic engagement betrays the usual traditional and comfortable categories of political participation drawn from the experiences of the previous generations. For example, in the literature, we are observing three different emerging modes of political participation among millennials. For example, we have volunteerism, lifestyle activism, and including digital citizenship. For example, volunteerism, in the study by J.L. Cornelio, he observed that volunteerism in the Philippines is very much a youth-driven phenomenon. For example, even for in charities attached to religious institutions, for example, Gawad Kalinga, which provides housing for the poor, or in university groups responding from time to time to disaster-affected communities. And many of these young people view their participation in volunteerism as an clear alternative to traditional political practices. On the other hand, the other two forms of emerging forms of political participation, lifestyle activism and digital citizenship, are not yet engaged so much in the literature on young Filipinos. So this is where my contribution comes in, and my attempt is to map the ways lifestyle activism and digital citizenship is practiced by young Filipinos. Although in this presentation, I will be focusing on the last one, which is digital citizenship, but my whole contribution touches on both aspects of emerging forms of political participation. So in this study, I employed the Generational Lens by Karl Mannheim, of course, in understanding millennial politics. Briefly, using this theory, my argument is that we should expect a different kind of political engagement because they are from a different kind of generation. Because generations have a diverse experience in terms of the social conditions. These social conditions, of course, or at least as expected, will shape the forms of engagement in politics. So for example here, I map the different social conditions and their resulting the resulting forms of political engagement in the post-World War II history of the Philippines. So those who were born in the 1920s and the 1930s, for example, who grew up experiencing the World War II and the end of the war, their politics is very much defined by this kind of war politics and state building. So building, for example, traditional political institutions, building a young republic that has to emerge out of the war. So this is so their politics is very much dedicated to reconstruction efforts. Contrast this, for example, for those who were born in the 1940s and the 1950s, who grew up under conditions of relative prosperity and disappointments in the attempts in the reconstruction efforts in the previous decades. And here you see that because of this relative prosperity and disappointment with the previous reconstruction efforts, they have engaged a more radical form of politics. So the 1960s radical politics, the anti-war, a flirting with more revolutionary types of politics. For example, discovering that the immobilized veterans in the countryside. So university students discovered this immobilized veterans in the countryside, World War II veterans, and formed the Communist Party of the Philippines with them. And then so on in the post-dictatorship era, you see that because of the changing social condition of democratization, the transition from authoritarianism, politics of this generation became more and more reformist and pragmatic. So this what I call the politics of good citizenship, for example, engage. So their politics more than revolutionary is now transformed into politics that involves voting, paying taxes, following the law, etc. Given the social conditions. So I argue here that with the social conditions that the millennials, current Filipino millennials, are exposed to, we expect a different kind of politics as well. So I draw from my ethnographic work with the Alter community in Twitter. I also did ethnographic work on other platforms including Facebook and Instagram, but this time I will be discussing this one on Twitter. So this is the Alter community in Twitter. The Alter community is sort of like a clandestine network of anonymized Twitter accounts. So they usually use hashtags as part of this community, hashtag AlterPH, hashtag Alter. And what they do with these accounts is that they use it to show their alternative identity. Although, of course, there are diverse practices of showing your alternative identity, primarily the Alter community is used for sexual experimentation. So it is used to look for partners. For example, the photo on the right, this is actually a more conservative photo. It's usually naked photos of yourself, and you invite others to do sexual activities for you. It is also used, for example, for online exhibitionism. You post photos and videos of yourself doing sexual activities, and also for exchange of porn. They exchange links to porn sites, access to porn sites, names of porn personalities to follow, etc. So this is a big community. For example, the one on the left is one of the top Alter users, the Laguna Tripper, which has hundreds of thousands of followers. So in fact, some of their hashtags are routinely hijacked by, for example, by mainstream politicians because they gain a lot of following, which is weird. So for example, you see the supporters of President Duterte using hashtag #AlterPH, hashtag Alter, just so they can penetrate or hijack these popular hashtags. And yet, of course, one of the accusations is that these young millennials, or these millennials, Filipino millennials, have engaged in this kind of practice, this alter. They have dedicated their life to sexual experimentation, devoid of politics, going back to the accusations of millennial apathy and being focused too much on sex, wealth, and social media. And yet, from my ethnographic work with them, I've seen some practices that more or less may be identified as something also that we can call as political engagement. For example, this is the one of the ethics, one of the rules of being part of the alter community is the insistence on practicing safe sex. So this parallels, for example, with advocacies, with mainstream advocacies on reproductive health or sexual health. So on the left, for example, this alter user is responding to allegations that he has been engaging in unprotected sex. This is important for alter users to respond to these kinds of allegations because you lose your status in the community once others can prove that you engage in unprotected sex, because this is frowned upon, this is disincentivized, this kind of practice. So in an effort to clear his name, for example, this alter user posted photos of boxes of condoms that he supposedly used in engaging in sexual practices. On the right side, you'll see tweets asking fellow members of the alter community to stop retweeting or patronizing videos of people or individuals who don't practice safe sex. So they do their own policing, and you will see there is sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit kind of advocacy making. So in the top right photo, for example, this is more or less more explicit. If you believe in condom use as an intervention to lower risk of sexually transmitted diseases, you like or you retweet only videos, only fuck videos with condoms in it. Another example is their policing on engaging in child pornography, or or engaging in sexual practices with supposedly minor members of the alter community. So just like in the previous one, those who engage in child exploitation, quote-unquote child porn, are sanctioned in the alter community, are monitored, and and they lose their social status as well. So for example, on the left side, you see this tweet reminding, just a sort of like a daily reminder, good morning alter, but with very explicit reminders to not engage in child porn, and a call to make the alter community a fun place for adults. On the other hand, you see on the right side some alter users who upload or post videos or photos of child doing sexual activities are reported immediately, and most of the time they are very successful in removing the post, having it removed from Twitter, or even banning the person from the alter community. So there. So there are others. These are just some of the examples. These are the more explicit ones. For example, there are many tweets. So although they invite sexual partners, they limit that they don't date ka-DDS, or meaning supporters of President Rodrigo Duterte, supposedly in response to the killings under the war on drugs. There were also commentaries on the rising inflation in the Philippines, for example, complaining that they have more time for work, but now they have less time. That they have to dedicate more time for work to combat to cope with the inflation, but have less time for sex. Because the 2019 midterm elections is right on the corner, there are also now posts asking members of the alter community to register and to vote, to be able to exercise their right to vote. So there are calls to vote before you flirt, and there are also exchanges regarding the difficulty of finding grinder dates in Mindanao, which is an island in the southern part of the Philippines, which is currently under martial law. Grindr is a dating platform for gays. It has various use as a dating platform, but mostly for sexual for looking for sexual partners. And because of the curfew imposed in the whole of the island of Mindanao, many members of the outer community are more having difficulties in looking for sexual partners. So drawing from drawing from these examples, I argue that this is what I call, or I see as, the emerging politics of digital citizenship among Filipino millennials. So to them, for example, their expressions, their expressions of convictions in this outer community, in this Twitter, in Instagram, and Facebook, are more authentic forms of political participation, because these are expressions of convictions done in everyday life context. They are more believable, they are more to be trusted. Unlike big claims, for example, protests, contentious politics, for example, because they tend to be, according to them, performative or in the service of strategic politics. This, on the other hand, for them, is more authentic in the sense that there is no goal but to express one's political convictions in a context of everyday life. Secondly, they also think that this form of political participation, this digital citizenship, is of course no less political than for example, participating in political rallies or voting or engaging politicians, in such a way that the experiences and the risks that they take as digital citizens are also more or less mirror the same risks that one would face if you would be a political citizen outside of the digital sphere. So for example, they pointed out that Facebook, Instagram, and even Twitter they mostly use it to maintain social relationships, families, classmates, relatives. And because of that, it's not usual for you to talk about something that is political. It's not expected for you to talk about your advocacies. On the contrary, it's expected that you remain silent on these issues, because they're not the usual topics that should be talked about in the digital world. So when they make claims, whether sexual health, anti-child pornography, or human rights claims, they risk their social relationships in these social media platforms. They also think that they also risk their digital bodies. Although their Twitter accounts are anonymized, for example, in the case of the outer community, they can be easily traced, as they have experienced before. Some members of the outer users have been traced using their IP addresses by the government. And they also risk their social capital in such a way that it is very difficult to build a social following in the social media platform. So when you start talking about political things, you also risk this social media following, this social capital that you have built in the social media platforms. The same way that others doing door-to-door campaigns, for example, or giving leaflets on the streets, risk their social capital that they have built in these communities. And lastly, for them, this digital citizenship, the actions that they do in social media, is real-world action against accusations, for example, that this is slacktivism or clicktivism. They think that this kind of dichotomy is rather unproductive, that the dichotomy between the virtual and the offline, because as digital natives whose lives is immersed in digital media, they do not really see this kind of clear dichotomy, but rather the boundaries are blurred. So their classmates, their family members, their neighbors are all parts of their digital communities. So when they make actions to influence, to touch, to comment, to relate to these members of their digital communities, it is as if they have made real-world actions as well. So whether the youth is really wasted on millennials, I end my presentation and say that part of the reason why the millennials, Filipino millennials, are being accused of millennial apathy is probably because, again, of moral panic that may have clouded the judgment again of missing this emerging politics of digital citizenship in the Philippines. Together with their inherited social baggages, they continue to find voices in creative and novel forms of political participation, including volunteerism, lifestyle activism, and in this case, digital citizenship. And political involvement and politics matters to the Filipino millennials, only so in ways that vastly differ from how it mattered to the previous generations. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks.